Okay, so here we are. We're going to do the second lesson on the Cold War. How did the Cold War escalate during the 50s and 60s? So if you guys could please make sure you have this worksheet out in front of you. In addition to this one, we're also going to be using the worksheet that has the arms race and the space race on it. I don't have a digital copy of that. That's why it's not up here. But just go through that and make sure you have both of those out. That's what we're going to be talking about here with how did the Cold War escalate during the 50s and the 60s. So let's just jump right into it. So in the last lesson, we talked about the origins of the Cold War and how tensions between the Soviet Union and the United States pretty much erupted into this Cold War after World War II. And we talked about some of the early things like the splitting up of Germany, the Marshall Plan, and the Berlin Airlift. So now in the 50s and 60s, tensions will escalate, get worse between the Soviet Union and the United States. Now, one of the major moments that took place was this right here that I'm going to show you.
That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. Columbia, this is Houston, AOS, over. Houston, Columbia, 9 gain, over. Roger, the EVA is progressing beautifully.
Okay, so right there, the first thing said is probably one of the most famous quotes in all of history. So hopefully you guys can see what that video was of. And let's think about why was this such a significant moment for Americans. So try to form an answer in your head right now if you of why this was so significant, because it was a big moment for the United States, big moment for humankind in general, but definitely a huge moment for Americans. So why do you think this was such a huge moment for Americans? So this is the moon landing, when Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin and landed on the moon. They were the first. The reason why it was so significant is they were the first human beings to land on the moon, and it was significant because the United States got there before the Soviet Union. So as we'll see in this lesson here is that one of the things that helped to escalate the tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union was this space race and trying to get into space and trying to top each other, one-up each other in what achievements they could make. And as we'll see, this moment becomes really, really significant as the United States becomes the first Americans to be able to walk on the moon. Okay, so let's go back a little bit. And in 1946, right after World War II ended, a communist government attempted to take over the government in Greece. And at this point, the United States starts to get nervous. The Americans start to feel that if Greece becomes communist, then Turkey will be next. So the President of the United States, Harry Truman, makes a speech following this crisis in Greece. You have a little excerpt from that speech on your worksheet right there. So take a minute right now and read over this document. And I want you to answer the question in bold right there. I know there's not a lot of space on the worksheet to answer the question, but just try to squeeze in an answer right next to it. That according to the document, what is the policy of the United States in regards to Europe? So what Harry S. Truman says, and I'm going to do my best Harry S. Truman voice right now. Just kidding. No, I'm not. I'm just going to read it because that would just be weird. So I believe it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or by outside pressure. Should we fail to aid Greece and Turkey in this fateful hour, the effect will be far-reaching to the West. The seeds of totalitarian regimes are nurtured by misery and want. They spread and grow in the evil soil of poverty and strife. They reach their full growth when the hope of a people for a better life has died. Therefore, I propose giving Greece and Turkey $400 million in aid. So, according to the document, what is the policy of the U.S. in regards to Europe? Hopefully, you guys are focusing Hopefully you guys are focusing on this to answer that question on that last part here. All right, and what's also interesting here to focus on is what he talks about: the seeds of totalitarian regimes are nurtured by misery and want. It's like Harry Truman has been taking my class and he's heard my super important global history concepts. This is exactly what I've been saying to you for 2 years, is that when people are desperate and things are bad, that's when radical ideas take hold. And he says that radical ideas or totalitarian regimes reach their full growth when the hope of a people for a better life has died. So let's put this all together here. What really is Harry S. Truman saying about what the policy of the United States should be? Why is he willing to give them $400 million in aid? Yes, try to answer this question right now in your head. Okay. Hopefully, what you're answering is that that the United States is going to give money and aid, lots of money and aid, to nations who are threatened by threatened by economic ruin or threatened by regimes, in the hope that that will prevent them from turning to radical communist ideas. So this is something that becomes known as the Truman Doctrine. So the Truman Doctrine is the idea or the principles that the United States should give support to countries that are threatened. Oh my gosh. Whoops. That countries, we're going too fast. Countries that are threatened. Oh my gosh, I did not read this. To countries that are threatened by Soviet forces. Okay, so this will become the policy of the United States here throughout the Cold War, especially in the early years in the 50s and the 60s and in the early 70s when these tensions are very high. So the Truman Doctrine basically states the United States will give support to countries that are threatened by Soviet forces or threatened by communism. So what the Truman Doctrine establishes is this policy called containment. And hopefully if you think back to 8th grade, you remember what this policy of containment is. You really just have to know the definition of containment to figure this out. If you want to contain something, you wanted to prevent it from spreading. So in this case, what is the United States trying to contain? Yes, communism. They are trying to contain communism. So this is the action or policy of preventing the expansion, another mistake here, preventing the expansion of communism during the Cold War. So this will be the policy that the United States will adopt, that they will do whatever it takes to prevent the spread of communism. It is first established in the Truman Doctrine, which, you know, why don't we add that? Whoa, oh my gosh, going ahead of ourselves again. Oh, this is a rough one, guys. I'm having a little trouble here. Let's say this is first established in the Truman Doctrine. Okay. All right. Thanks for hanging along here, bearing with me. No pun intended, get it, bearing with me. Okay. Okay, that was just weird. So the action or policy of preventing the expansion of communism during the during the Cold War, first established in the Truman Doctrine. So now we have containment, we have the Truman Doctrine. Okay, so the next thing you have on your worksheet is a quote there from Nikita Khrushchev, who becomes Stalin's successor in the Soviet Union. So take a minute to read over that document right now and answer the question below. And how does he view this policy, and what prediction will he make? This prediction will kind of be important a little bit later on in the lesson. So pause here and answer that question. Okay, so now in 1953, big moment in the Cold War here. Joseph Stalin dies at the age of 73. He was not murdered. The official death or cause of death that was given was a cerebral hemorrhage. He was 73 years old. So there are some people, conspiracy theorists who think maybe he was poisoned, but there's no evidence for any foul play, just simply that he had a hemorrhage and died. Now, when he dies, his body is placed right next to Lenin's right here. It's embalmed just like Lenin's and placed in the Red Square right next to him. You can see in this picture here the thousands upon thousands of people who showed up for his funeral. So now the issue is who becomes his successor. There's a little minor power struggle, and who emerges is as his successor is Nikita Khrushchev. All right, so from 1953 to 1964, it's Nikita Khrushchev who is the leader of the Soviet Union. After 1964, Leonid Brezhnev becomes the leader of the Soviet Union. Those are two leaders we're going to talk about in this lesson. And yes, guys, those are his real eyebrows. Pretty intense right there. We look at some great facial hair, but Brezhnev, his eyebrows have got to take the cake right there. It takes years to grow eyebrows like that. All right, so one of the things that we're going to talk about Khrushchev first. One of his major things he does is something called de-Stalinization. So we're going to watch this little short video clip about what de-Stalinization is and the importance of it.
Inside the Soviet Union, Khrushchev wanted to overcome the legacy of Stalinist terror and hardship. He put more resources into the production of consumer goods and housing. Thousands of political prisoners had been freed from the Gulag.
My father was a strong believer in the communism. For him it was the best life to the people. It is like the heaven of the earth. And he many times repeat that it is impossible to live in the heaven surrounded by the barbed wires.
Khrushchev used the 20th Soviet Party Congress to end the hero worship of Stalin and expose the cruelties of his dictatorship. During a secret session, Khrushchev made a speech that astounded everyone present.
When he made his speech, people in the hall started to groan. There were shouts of shame.
Stalin, Khrushchev told his audience, had ordered the imprisonment and execution of thousands of loyal communists, workers, managers, and soldiers. No one, peasant or general, had been safe from Stalin's terror.
Khrushchev himself wasn't without guilt. He had played an active part in Stalin's repressions in Ukraine and in other parts of the country.
И поэтому у Хрущева не было морально-нравственного права
He had no moral right to speak about Stalin as if he himself was pure.
чистых и святых.
Нового мне он ничего не сказал.
He did not say anything new for me, or for the majority of my friends. He did not say everything that needed to be said, but we were happy that at least it was said. He said it in a half-whisper, literally in secret. It was not printed in the newspapers, but came out in a leaflet read at party meetings, and sometimes outside. We used to say, "This is the beginning of truth. Truth will win."
Правда победит.
Страх, вот этот мучительный. This fear, this tormenting fear after Stalin's death began to fade away.
Стал как-то ослабевать. Все больше и больше.
After the 20th Congress, it looked as if this fear would never return.
Уже казалось, что страх вообще никогда не вернется.
Khrushchev's secret speech was perfect propaganda for the American-financed Radio Free Europe. The text of Khrushchev's speech was broadcast after the CIA received a copy from the Israeli intelligence service.
They were just repeating for 24 hours, 1 hour speech, over and over and over again. And this was to the party people who were brainwashed, were led to believe, and they did believe, that Stalin is God, that couldn't make any mistake. Everything he did was infallible. Suddenly, their faith, their religion collapsed.
Oops, all right. So we're going to cut that off there. There's other videos on YouTube that finish it, but that pretty much gives you a summary. So what was de-Stalinization? What does this mean? It basically here is a backlash against Stalin's rule. You saw in the beginning it talks about how Khrushchev began to open up some more consumer goods. He released people from gulags, and then they spent a good portion of the video talking about this secret speech that he gave. So in 1956, in a speech here, or I'm sorry, it was a secret session. But he gives a speech and he basically exposes all these crimes that Stalin had committed, condemns them, and this starts this backlash here against his rule. It ended his rule of terror, and it started to, for the most part, not super liberal, but kind of started to liberalize the Soviet Union just a little bit. And as part of this de-Stalinization, portraits of Stalin were removed from public places. Stalingrad was renamed. It was this whole process of trying to stop the hero worship of him that he had put out for so long. So the thing is that we talked about, earlier in class about the brutality of Stalin's regime and all the people that were killed and all the deaths that he was responsible for. Well, a lot of people living in the Soviet Union during that time didn't know what the extent of his brutality and the extent of his damage. And part of this de-Stalinization was starting to make that public a little bit. So any institutions and localities that bared his name, any historians were commissioned to rewrite textbooks to deflate his reputation. And this is just trying to move away from this hero worship. So Stalin's body was removed from Lenin's in the mid-1960s. And at first, this left picture, the picture on the left, shows you where his body was placed. It was just buried next to the wall of the Kremlin with just a little flower kind of put in front of it. No sort of tomb, no sort of marking, just like a little thing that just said that's where Stalin was. Over the course of the years, they decided to actually give him a nice tomb. So this on the right is what his tomb looks like today. Well, there's a bust of him. There's an actual grave marker there. So in recent years, there's kind of been this movement back towards like reconsidering Stalin. Maybe he wasn't quite so evil. But the point is that during Khrushchev's reign, you do see this process of de-Stalinization. Now, in also an event that escalated tensions here was the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. So stop here for a second and just read your summary of the Berlin Wall there. With the idea of what it is. You have some images here of the construction of the Berlin Wall. So pause here and read that summary. Okay, now that you've read that, we're going to watch another short video here about the Berlin Wall. That just gives you a summary of the construction of it and what the significance was. It's a pretty impressive video here about the wall. So we're going to look at that. Probably after a short ad first.
You're new.
I am.
Ex-military?
4 tours.
You work with computers?
Yes, this is just an
That's
ad.
classified now. But your job was network security. That's classified, sir.
Let's cut to the chase here.
What's your assessment of our security? Porous.
Porous?
The old solutions aren't working. The world has changed.
Meaning?
It's not just security. It's defense.
It's not just security, it's defense. BAE Systems.
All right, here we go.
Mr. Gorbachev.
Tear down this wall.
Okay. All right, so there you go, a little bit more background on the Berlin Wall and why it was constructed. So basically, if you didn't catch it in the video, the reason why the Berlin Wall was constructed is that, remember, as we talked about in the last lesson, East and West Berlin was divided up, even though Berlin was deep inside the Eastern Bloc. So it was pretty easy for people to just go from East Berlin into West Berlin, where things were better and capitalist. You literally had to walk across the street. And some people living in East Berlin had their jobs in West Berlin. And you just saw all these people moving into the West, getting into the West from West Berlin, and it became really embarrassing to the communist government there and to the Soviet Union. So one night they just put up barbed wire. People literally woke up and could not cross the street anymore. They lost their jobs over there, and families were divided apart because they were separated by this street, and the barbed wire just appeared one day. And the barbed wire was eventually replaced by these walls, and you saw in the video the extent of this wall and how dangerous it became to try to cross it. So the Berlin Wall now becomes an actual physical symbol here of the division between the East and West, and further increases the tensions during this time. All right. Now, obviously, the Berlin Wall was built because people kept going into the West, because living under a communist government was not the greatest rule for people. People did not have the greatest lives living there. So there were some uprisings. In 1956, there's the an uprising in Hungary, and in 1968, there is also the Prague Spring. Those are the two most significant uprisings. So you have on your worksheet a couple of readings there about these uprisings. So you're going to stop the video here. You're going to read those readings on the Hungarian uprising in 1956 and on the Prague Spring in 1968, and then go ahead and fill out this chart on the bottom based on that. All right. Also, as you're filling it out, you're going to fill out, as part of the Soviet response, you should also fill out what the Brezhnev Doctrine is. Yes. And woof, those eyebrows, man, they are really something there. So fill out the Brezhnev Doctrine too. So again, the revolts, the reason for the revolt, the Soviet response for both, and then what the Brezhnev Doctrine is. Pause the video here to do that. Okay, now that you've done that, we're going to go over that in class, so just make sure that you've done your best on that, and, everything, the answers are in the readings. It shouldn't be too difficult. So now the next thing that increases tensions in the 1950s and 1960s is this so-called arms race. So now let's turn your attention to the second worksheet on the back of it. You have a summary there of the arms race between 1945 and 1963. Essentially what this is just the race to get the newest, most advanced weapons. So you see the Soviets and the United States just from the moment that the atomic bomb has exploded until the 1960s, just racing to get the better weapons, and building up their arsenal. So you can read over that summary about the major events during that. Now, what's the problem with this competition for weapons? Hopefully, in your head, you're answering this question, and you're thinking of something like this: mutually assured destruction. That basically the fear is that you continue to build up your weapons, once you use one, and if the tensions between these two powers erupted into a physical violent conflict, they would just unleash these weapons on each other, and it would basically completely destroy both civilizations and probably the world. So during the Cold War, as tensions increase, this is always the threat here, is that they're always on the brink of having mutually assured destruction, basically unleashing these weapons on each other and destroying each other. And think back to when we watched the video about the atomic bomb being dropped in Japan and the destruction of those two cities, to think about what it would be like now with even more improved weapons since 1945. And this is what makes tensions during the Cold War really high. All right, now you also had, in addition to that, the space race, what we started this worksheet, this lesson with. So if you flip back to the front of your worksheet where it says the space race, the arm race, take a second right now to read over that summary and then look over the chart. And in the chart, make sure you fill in on the box what the definition of the space race was. Okay, so the space race was the second part of it, about trying to get into space, using new technology now to go to a frontier that no humans had ever gone to. Now, in the early years of the space race, the first satellite into orbit was Sputnik from the USSR. The first living being in space was a dog, Latka, also from the USSR, and the first man into space, Yuri Gagarin, was also from the Soviet Union. So you can see here that the Soviet Union was winning the space race pretty significantly in the 1960s. So now going back to what I showed you guys in the beginning of this, that moon landing, this is also why that moon landing is so important, is because the United States was losing really bad. They were getting their butts kicked by the Soviets when it came to the space race. So there was really this push here to get to the moon before they did, which you saw in the video in 1969 they do. Okay, so this is just what you need to know is put this in context of the larger Cold War and how this was related to that as well. Alright, so let's wrap up here. Basically, at the end of this video, at the end of doing all this work, you should be able to answer this question: in what ways did the Cold War escalate in the 1950s and 1960s? So I would find somewhere to answer this question. Either write it out in bullets or write it out in a full paragraph, but you definitely should be able to answer this now based on what we've done. Okay, now just like the other video, please make sure that you're making notes of any questions that you have. The terms to know are in a box on each worksheet. Those are very important terms. Make sure you're keeping track of the definitions of all of those, so that way when we go over it, if you have any questions, you're able to ask them then. Okay, so that concludes the escalation of the Cold War in the 50s and 60s. The next lesson is going to be on how the Cold War impacted other places across the world. It's going to be a little bit more in depth and a little bit longer than the first two lessons were, but wait for that. Okay? All right, guys, so thanks for listening. Thanks for being here, and I will see you guys in the next lesson. Bye.